The desert burned beneath a merciless sun, a golden sea of silence stretching beyond what eyes could bear. Every breath was heat. Every sound was the whisper of dying grass. In that endless expanse walked a woman who no longer knew her name. Her wrists were bound, the ropes cutting into skin turned raw by pain. Dust clung to her lashes, blood dried on her lips. Yet even in ruin, there was something heartbreakingly alive about her, like a broken hymn still reaching for heaven. Each step she took was a rebellion against the emptiness that wanted to swallow her whole. The sky shimmered, a cruel mirage of freedom, but she didn't stop. Her body trembled, frail and stubborn, her voice barely a breath. "Please, God, not like this." It wasn't a plea for life. It was a plea for meaning. The kind that only comes when pain has burned away everything but truth. Somewhere deep inside her, a small spark refused to die, whispering that maybe someone, somewhere, still cared enough to listen. And then came the sound, soft, rhythmic, distant. Hooves on dry earth. At first she thought it was her mind playing tricks again, that cruel echo of false salvation that came before the end. But the sound grew louder. A horse, a man, a shadow moving through the haze like the ghost of a promise. She froze, breath catching, unsure whether to pray or to run. The figure drew closer. Sun behind him, his outline blurring with the horizon. He was tall, broad, his hat tilted low, his silence heavy. The desert seemed to bow to him, as if it too remembered his name. Her knees buckled. She fell, dust rising around her like smoke. The man dismounted slowly. Spurs clinked, leather creaked, and with each sound her heart thudded harder. Not with hope, but with memory. She whispered hoarsely, "Don't untie me. Just do it." Her words trembled, half despair, half defiance. The man stopped dead in his tracks. The wind stopped too, as if heaven itself held its breath. He looked at her, not with lust, not with pity, but with something older, deeper, recognition. He took off his hat. The light caught the scars on his face, the years carved into him like a confession. His name was Jack Callahan. Once a soldier, then a rancher, now just a man who had long forgotten what mercy felt like. Yet something in her eyes, those desperate, fractured eyes, stirred the ache he'd buried decades ago. He knelt beside her. "You're safe now," he said softly, his voice rough from dust and regret. She laughed, a sound fragile and broken. "Safe?" she whispered. "There's no safe. Not with him still breathing." Jack's jaw tightened. "Who?" Her lips parted, a single word slipping out before she went limp in his arms. "Wade." Her body sagged against him, too weak to fight the fever blazing beneath her skin. He held her, feeling her trembling ease into the rhythm of unconsciousness. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of someone else's life in his hands, and with it, a strange and forgotten tenderness. He sighed, the sound carrying more prayer than words. "All right, miss. You found the wrong man to die in front of. I don't bury the living." He lifted her onto his horse. The animal shifted, uneasy beneath the weight of two souls bound by the same ghosts. The sky dimmed as they rode, the horizon blushing red like a wound healing under light. He didn't know who she was or why she spoke the name Wade, but he knew that wherever her pain came from, it wasn't done yet. And neither was he. The wind softened as night crept over the land. Stars flickered awake, quiet witnesses to this strange crossing of two broken paths. Her head rested against his chest, her breath shallow but steady. He could feel her heart, faint, stubborn, alive. He glanced down once, just long enough to whisper something only the stars would hear. "You're safe now." There was no music, no angels, no sudden salvation, just the steady rhythm of hooves and the promise of a story that refused to end in silence. Maybe that's all redemption ever is, not a grand beginning, but a single choice to turn back toward the light. And if your heart, somewhere in this moment, feels the weight of her struggle, the ache of his quiet mercy, then let it stay with you. Because sometimes, in a world that forgets what kindness sounds like, a simple story can heal more than we know. If this scene stirred something inside you, take a second to breathe, to feel, to listen. Leave a thought in the comments so others know they're not walking through their deserts alone. Hit that like button, subscribe if your soul needs a little more light, and stay close, because the next ride through this wild west of hearts is only just beginning. The morning came slow, crawling over the hills like a hesitant confession. The ranch looked smaller in the early light, the wood grey and tired, the wind carrying the faint scent of rain. Jack Callahan stood by the doorway, his silhouette framed against the dawn. He hadn't slept. The girl had been burning with fever all night, whispering names into the dark, names that didn't belong in a peaceful place. He'd given her water, wiped the sweat from her brow, and sat there beside her as the crickets sang their mournful hymns. For years he'd thought he was done with this world's brokenness, but now here she was, fragile, trembling, alive, and his soul felt like dry earth remembering rain. Her eyelids fluttered open with the gentleness of a wounded bird trying to fly. For a moment she looked lost, eyes glassy, mouth dry. The first word she spoke wasn't a question, but a memory breaking through. "You untied me," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, like it had travelled too far to be heard. Jack nodded slowly. Seemed like the decent thing to do. The words hung between them, simple, awkward, human. Her gaze moved from his face to the rough wooden walls, then to the window where the sunlight filtered through dust like gold. She looked as though she couldn't decide whether to trust the peace around her or flee from it. He poured her a bit of water and helped her sit up. Her wrists, still marked with red grooves, trembled as she lifted the tin cup. She drank as if learning how to live again. "Why?" she asked after a while, eyes tracing the calluses on his hands. "You don't even know me." Jack rubbed his thumb over his jaw, a habit he'd never broken. "Guess I don't need to. You look like someone who's had enough hurt for one lifetime." Her lips parted, and for a long moment no sound came. Then, like a confession pulled from her bones, she said, "My name is Clara." He let the name settle into the air. It sounded soft, fragile, but it carried weight. He nodded once. "Jack," he said simply. "Just Jack." Outside, the wind rustled through the dead grass, whispering against the worn fence posts. It was the kind of quiet that made old hearts remember. Clara's gaze lingered on the horizon, as if expecting the world to come crashing back. "You live here alone?" she asked. He gave a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. For a long time now. Something in the way he said it made her chest tighten. She could tell this was a man who carried his loneliness like a second skin, but behind his silence was something deeper. Kindness forged in sorrow, the kind that didn't need to be spoken. It made her want to breathe again, to trust the slow rhythm of her heart. He moved to the fireplace, adding wood to the flames. The crackle filled the space between them. She looked around the small cabin, shelves lined with worn books, a rifle above the door, and an old picture turned face down on the mantel. It wasn't a house. It was a memory that refused to let go. "Were you a soldier?" she asked softly. He paused, the flame reflecting in his eyes. "Once. A long time ago." He didn't say more, and she didn't press. Some wounds were better left to breathe in silence. Instead, she looked at him with a kind of fragile gratitude, as though her soul recognized the broken pieces in his. "Thank you," she murmured, "for not leaving me there." Jack gave a short nod. "I've buried enough people," he said quietly. "Didn't feel right adding another." Her eyes softened. "You talk like a man who doesn't expect kindness back." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I don't do it for kindness." Their eyes met then, hers full of fear and healing, his heavy with things unsaid. In that small, weathered room, two hearts, bruised by life, found the faintest pulse of trust. By afternoon, the fever began to ease. Clara slept deeply, the first real sleep in days. Jack sat outside on the porch, sharpening his knife without thinking, staring at the horizon. The land stretched wide and lonely, the kind that kept secrets. He thought about the name she'd spoken. Wade. It sat in his mind like a storm cloud, familiar and bitter. There was a time he'd heard that name shouted across a battlefield, and later whispered in the dark corners of town, a name that never meant anything good. He didn't know what Wade had done to her, but the way she flinched in her sleep told him enough. He exhaled slowly, wiping sweat from his brow. The sun was high now, glaring hard as truth. Behind him, Clara stirred. She came to the door, wrapped in one of his old shirts, her hair tangled from sleep. She stood there quietly, watching him. "You don't have to stay out here," she said. Her voice was small, but it carried something tender. He gave a faint smile. "I have been alone too long to mind the quiet." She hesitated, then stepped closer, sitting on the edge of the porch. For a while, neither spoke. The world around them was still, the air thick with cicadas, the earth cracked and dry. And yet, something gentle lingered between them, like the faint scent of rain before a storm. After a while, she said, "I used to teach children, back east." Her eyes dimmed as she spoke, as if remembering something lost. "I thought I was coming west to start a school. They said they needed teachers. But it was a lie." Her voice trembled. "They said it was a school. It wasn't." Jack turned his head slightly. He didn't ask what it was. He didn't need to. The truth was already written across her face. He simply said, "You're safe here." She nodded, though her eyes betrayed the disbelief she couldn't speak. The wind changed, carrying the scent of rain. Jack looked toward the dark line of clouds building far off. "Storm's coming," he murmured. "Good," she said quietly. "Maybe it'll wash some of this dust away." He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time in years he felt something stir in his chest that wasn't anger or grief. It was fragile, like light trying to reach through cracks in stone. When night came, they ate in silence. She watched the firelight dance across his weathered hands, the small scars that told stories he'd never tell. He caught her gaze once, and she looked away, embarrassed, but he only smiled. A quiet, weary smile that said more than words could. Outside, the rain began to fall, soft and slow, tapping against the roof like a lullaby. She listened to it, letting the sound soothe the ache in her bones. "It's been so long since I felt safe enough to hear the rain," she whispered. Jack's voice was low, gentle. "Sometimes that's all healing is, remembering what peace sounds like." Her eyes filled with quiet tears. "You talk like a preacher." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, Mom. Just a man who's made enough mistakes to know better." The fire crackled, the rain whispered, and the world outside seemed to pause for them, two lost souls resting in the hollow of mercy. The air carried warmth again, the kind that made hearts remember they were still beating. As the flames dimmed, Clara's eyes grew heavy. Jack rose to his feet, setting another log on the fire. "Sleep," he said quietly. "You'll need your strength." She nodded, curling under the old blanket he'd laid out for her. Before she drifted off, her voice, soft and drowsy, broke the silence. "Jack?" He paused at the door. "Yeah?" "If I scream in my sleep, don't wake me. Just make sure I'm still here when I open my eyes." He didn't answer right away. He looked at her, the fragile outline of her body under the blanket, and something in him broke, something hard and old. "You'll be here," he said at last. "I'll make sure of it." He stepped outside again, letting the rain soak through his shirt, staring out into the dark horizon. Somewhere, lightning flickered, soft, distant, beautiful. He thought of the man named Wade, and his hands clenched. The world was full of men who thought they could break something and walk away, but Jack knew better. Some things stayed, burned into the soul until you made them right. He closed his eyes, let the rain wash the dust from his skin, and for the first time in years breathed deep without feeling the weight of his sins. Inside, the woman slept soundly, her breathing steady, her body beginning to heal. The night hummed with a strange peace, one neither of them understood, but both desperately needed. And if you're still here, listening beneath the same sky, let this moment rest in your heart. And because sometimes healing doesn't come with thunder, it comes with quiet rain, with the sound of two strangers remembering how to breathe again. If this story warmed something inside you, let it stay. Leave a thought, share a feeling. Let others know they're not alone in their deserts. Tap the like, whisper a subscribe, and ride with us again next time, where broken hearts keep finding their way home. Morning light spilled across the worn wood floor, soft as forgiveness. The rain had passed in the night, leaving behind the scent of wet earth and renewal. Clara woke to the sound of quiet, real quiet, not the kind that followed fear, but the kind that let her body remember rest. She lay still for a while, wrapped in one of Jack's old blankets, listening to the fire's faint crackle. Her wrists no longer burned. The fever had broken. For the first time since she could remember, her body didn't feel like a cage. Outside, she could hear him. The slow rhythm of boots against the porch, the creak of a saddle being tightened, the low murmur of a man talking softly to his horse, words meant for no one but himself. She sat up, hair tangled, heartbeat steady. The morning light made everything look kinder, the dust motes floating in gold, the faded curtains swaying slightly in the breeze. It was still a lonely place, this ranch, but now it felt alive. Jack came in carrying a bucket of water. His shirt clung to his shoulders, his face still damp from washing. When he saw her awake, he gave a small nod. "Morning." She smiled faintly, voice still hoarse. "Morning." He set the bucket down, poured a little water into a basin, and slid it toward her. "You can clean up a bit if you'd like." His tone was simple, gentle. No questions, no pity. Just the calm presence of someone who'd seen too much to ask for stories before their time. She washed her face in silence. The cool water against her skin felt like rebirth. When she looked up, he was by the stove, frying something in an old cast-iron pan. The smell of eggs and coffee filled the room, heavy and comforting. "Didn't think I'd eat again," she murmured, half to herself. "You will," he said without turning. "Hunger's a stubborn thing. Keeps us alive when nothing else does." They ate quietly, sitting across from each other at the small table. The rhythm of their silence was oddly peaceful, no awkwardness, no need to fill the space with noise. She watched him, the way his hands moved, steady, precise, the hands of a man who'd spent his life fixing what others broke. "You built this place yourself?" she asked softly. He shrugged. "Bit by bit. Never much, but enough." She traced the rim of her cup with a finger. "It's more than enough." He looked up then, their eyes meeting for just a heartbeat too long. She looked away quickly, but something warm lingered in the air between them. Later that morning, Clara stepped outside. The world looked different after the storm, cleaner, quieter. The air smelled of grass and sun-warmed soil. She stood barefoot on the porch, feeling the rough wood beneath her feet, the sky stretching endlessly overhead. Jack was by the corral, repairing a broken fence. His movements were slow, methodical, patient. She watched him for a long while, realizing that solitude suited him the way peace suits prayer. It wasn't absence, but devotion. He glanced over his shoulder once, noticing her watching, and lifted a hand in a silent greeting. She smiled, shy but genuine. She walked toward him, hesitating a few steps away. "Can I help?" she asked. "You can hand me those nails," he said simply, and she did. They worked side by side, and though they barely spoke, something invisible began to knit itself between them, a trust made of quiet gestures, the kind of bond that grows in silence rather than speech. After a while she said, "You don't talk much." "Don't need to," he replied. "Words don't always fix things." She nodded, understanding too well. "No," she said softly, "but sometimes they remind us we're still human." He looked at her then, his eyes softer than she expected. "Guess we both needed reminding." The afternoon heat settled in slow and heavy. Jack led the horses to shade, while Clara gathered her courage to wander beyond the porch. The land stretched wide around her, endless and wild. She could feel the ghost of fear still clinging to her, whispering that safety was an illusion. But then she saw him watching from the corral, and that fear began to loosen its grip. She found herself humming, just a faint tune from her childhood, something about summer and river light. Jack paused his work, head tilted slightly. The sound was delicate, trembling, but it filled the air like balm. He didn't say anything, but when she finished, he said quietly, "That was nice." She blushed. "It's nothing." "Just a song my mother used to sing." "Still," he murmured, "nice to hear something gentle again." Later, as the sun lowered, he brought out an old book from inside, a worn copy of Great Expectations. He handed it to her without a word. She traced the spine with her fingers. "You read?" she asked, surprised. "Used to," he said. "My ma insisted. Said stories were how people kept their souls from drying up." She smiled softly. She was right. As the light turned golden, they sat on the porch together, reading a few lines aloud. His voice was low and rough, hers soft and trembling. The words felt like prayer, simple, healing, human. When she laughed at one of the lines, he looked at her, truly looked, and in her smile he saw something he hadn't seen in years, life refusing to stay broken. When night came, the desert cooled. The wind carried the scent of sage and rain-soaked earth. Jack lit a lantern, its glow casting halos across the porch. Clara sat close, her hair falling over her shoulders, her eyes reflecting the soft flame. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You don't have to," he replied. "Just get better." "I'm trying," she whispered. "It's hard to remember who I was before all this." He leaned back, gaze steady on the horizon. "Then remember who you are now. Sometimes that's the only way forward." His words sank into her like sunlight into cold soil. She felt something loosen in her chest, a small, steady bloom of peace. A coyote howled in the distance, lonely and haunting. Jack's hand rested on his knee, fingers brushing the revolver at his side out of habit. She noticed, then said softly, "You're always watching." He nodded. "World's not kind, but kindness survives longer when you guard it." For a while they sat in silence, the kind that feels full, not empty. The lantern light danced across their faces, two souls drawn together not by fate, but by the quiet ache of survival. She looked at him and thought, perhaps healing doesn't come with grand gestures. It comes with mornings like this, with shared silence and gentle care. The moon climbed higher, silvering the land. Jack finally rose, stretching. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we'll start mending the roof." She smiled faintly. "You trust me with a hammer?" He smirked, the faintest ghost of humor. "We'll find out." When she went to bed that night, the wind whispered through the window like a lullaby. She lay there with the book by her side, the warmth of his kindness still lingering in her chest. The walls creaked, the fire sighed, and for the first time since her world had shattered, she didn't dread the darkness. Outside, Jack leaned against the railing, watching the stars scatter like spilled salt across the sky. He thought about the woman sleeping under his roof, the one who'd stumbled into his world half dead and somehow breathed life back into it. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Trouble always found its way back, especially with a name like Wade still echoing in his memory. But for now, there was peace. And peace, however fragile, was worth keeping. He closed his eyes, breathed in the cool air, and let it settle his restless spirit. The night was still, the land at rest. Inside, Clara dreamed, not of the men who had hurt her, but of a quiet porch, a kind stranger, and a sunrise she hadn't yet seen. Somewhere in that dream, her heart began to mend. And as you listen beneath the same sky, maybe you can feel it too. That slow warmth rising through the cracks of pain, reminding you that healing doesn't come all at once. It comes softly, like dawn finding its way over the hills. If this story touched a corner of your heart, let that light stay. Leave a whisper in the comments, share a thought of kindness, press that like to let others feel it too. Subscribe and keep riding with us, because love in all its quiet forms is still out there, waiting to be found. The sky was the color of ash when Eliza arrived. A single rider cutting through the silence, her horse stumbling with exhaustion, her dress torn and dusted by the miles she had outrun. Jack heard the hooves before he saw her, steady but broken, the kind of rhythm that carries both desperation and memory. He stepped off the porch, his hand instinctively brushing the grip of his revolver, though something in the air told him it wasn't danger coming, but pain wearing a woman's face. The horse stopped short in front of him, nostrils flaring. Eliza slid down awkwardly, her boots hitting the dirt with a dull thud. She stood there for a moment, swaying slightly, eyes rimmed red, skin pale beneath the grime. Then she whispered, "Jack." The sound of his name seemed to tear something open between them. It had been years since he'd heard that voice, fragile and determined all at once. "Eliza Reed," he said slowly, disbelief softening into sorrow. "You look like hell." She gave a faint, humorless smile. "Hell's not far behind me." Her voice cracked on the words. She reached into her saddlebag with trembling fingers and pulled out a small wooden box, holding it like something sacred. "I brought something," she said, her voice shaking. "You need to see it." Jack took the box. It was heavier than it looked, the wood worn smooth with age. He opened it slowly. Inside were papers, sealed letters, a few receipts, and at the very bottom, a single folded page stained with what looked like blood. He unfolded it carefully. Tom's handwriting stared back at him, his brother's name signed at the bottom of something that smelled like betrayal. Eliza's breath hitched. "It's all there," she said. "Names, dates, money. Everything Wade's been doing, and Tom's part in it." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of storm and dust. Jack's fingers tightened around the paper. His voice dropped low, steady. "You shouldn't have brought this here." Eliza's eyes glistened with tears. "I didn't have anywhere else to go. If Wade finds out I took it..." She couldn't finish. Jack didn't need her to. He already knew what Wade did to those who crossed him. He'd seen it once, years ago, when law and sin were just two sides of the same coin. Clara appeared at the doorway then, her hair loose, the light from inside the house outlining her like a ghost reborn. She held one of Jack's old shirts around her shoulders, her eyes wide as she saw the stranger trembling in the yard. For a moment, no one spoke. Just the sound of wind, the low thunder far in the distance, and three broken souls breathing in the same dying afternoon. Eliza turned toward Clara, her gaze soft but haunted. "You're the girl," she whispered. "No, the teacher from back east." Clara stiffened. "You know me?" "I know what he did to you." Eliza said. Her voice trembled. "And I'm so sorry." Jack stepped between them, his presence grounding the moment like a wall against chaos. "Enough," he said gently. "We're all running from the same fire." He led Eliza inside. The room filled with the quiet rustle of paper as he spread the documents across the table. Names of women, transactions, routes, signatures. It wasn't a business. It was a wound mapped in ink. He could feel Clara standing behind him, her breath shallow. Her hand brushed the edge of the table as if steadying herself against a past that refused to stay buried. "That's him," she whispered. Her finger hovered above one of the names scrawled in Wade's hand. "He branded me like property." The words left her trembling. Jack's jaw clenched so tight he thought it might break. He folded the papers carefully, each movement deliberate, controlled, but his eyes were a storm barely held back. Eliza's tears spilled over. "Tom tried to stop it," she said. "He said he'd find a way to make it right. But Wade owns everything now. The men, the law, the silence." Jack's voice came low, almost prayerful. "Not everything." He looked up at her, and there it was, the old fire she remembered from years past, the one that made men stand straighter when he walked into a room. "Not me." Outside, lightning tore the sky open. The air thickened with the smell of rain and rage. Clara moved closer to the window, watching the horizon flicker. "He'll come," she whispered. "Men like Wade always do." Jack nodded slowly. "Then let him come." He picked up the box, closing it with a snap that sounded like a vow. "But he won't find what he expects." Eliza watched him, exhaustion etched into her face. "You can't fight him alone, Jack." He turned toward her, expression unreadable. "I already am." As thunder rolled, Clara reached out and touched his arm. It was a small gesture, almost nothing, yet it steadied him more than any weapon could. Her voice was quiet, trembling with both fear and faith. "You don't have to carry it all yourself." He looked down at her hand, pale against his skin, and something in his chest loosened. For years he'd believed redemption was for other men, men who hadn't done what he'd done, who hadn't lost what he'd lost. But now, standing in that fragile light, with two women bound to him by fate and pain, he felt a strange warmth rise through the cracks in his soul. Healing doesn't always come from peace. Sometimes it comes from purpose. The storm broke at last, rain hammering against the roof like drums of war. They moved quickly. Jack sealing the papers back into the box, Eliza tending the fire, Clara helping shutter the windows. Lightning flashed, and for an instant Jack saw their faces illuminated, the survivor, the confessor, and the man who would have to stand between them and the darkness chasing them all. As the rain poured, Jack found himself thinking of Tom, the boy who used to chase him through the fields, the man who'd once trusted him more than anyone. He couldn't reconcile that memory with the signature he'd just seen, but he knew one thing with cold certainty. Tom was still out there, and Wade's reach was getting closer every hour. When the thunder softened, they sat together around the fire. Eliza spoke in fragments, telling what she knew. Wade had built his empire in the shadows, buying loyalty with fear, binding families through debt and sin. Tom had become his right hand, too weak or too lost to resist. Clara listened, eyes distant, the flames reflected in them like a lifetime she couldn't unsee. Jack poured them coffee, though none of them drank much. It was the gesture that mattered, the warmth in their hands, the reminder that they were still here, still breathing. He looked at both women, then said quietly, "Tomorrow I ride out. There's a church west of here, half buried. Wade's man, Corbin, uses it to collect. If I can cut him off there, maybe we stand a chance." Eliza shook her head. "You'll die." He smiled faintly. "Maybe. But I've done enough living without reason." Clara's voice broke through, firm despite the tremor. "Then let me come." He looked at her, eyes softening. "You're not ready." "Neither are you," she said. For a long time they just stared at each other, the silence between them heavy with everything unspoken. Trust, fear, something fragile and unnamed. Finally Jack said, "You'll stay. Both of you. If I don't come back by dawn, you ride north. Don't look back." Eliza started to protest, but Clara placed a hand on her arm, quieting her. She understood. There are some fights that can't be shared. He rose, moving toward the door. The wind howled against it, trying to push its way in. He paused there, one hand on the latch, his profile framed in the flickering light. "If Wade's coming," he said softly, "then hell's coming with him." No one answered. There was nothing left to say. Only the rain, falling like forgiveness on a land that had forgotten mercy. Inside, the fire burned low. Clara sat staring into the flames, her eyes reflecting the storm outside. She felt the ache of fear in her chest, but beneath it, something else, a quiet strength she didn't know she possessed. She whispered to herself, almost a prayer, "Come back, Jack." Outside, the man who had spent his life running from redemption saddled his horse beneath the crying sky. The wind tore through his coat, rain soaking the brim of his hat, but he didn't flinch. He mounted, turned once toward the small house glowing with faint light, and then rode out into the dark. The night swallowed him whole, and somewhere behind him 2 women waited, one haunted by guilt, one healed by hope, and both bound to the same man who refused to stop believing that decency still mattered. And as the storm rolled across the plains, if your heart felt the weight of his choice, the courage it takes to walk back into the fire, let that feeling linger. Because sometimes love is not soft or easy. Sometimes it rides into the rain, carrying the last light of what is good in this world. If this story touched you, breathe it in, let it heal something small within you. Leave your thought in the dust of our trail, share it in the comments, press the like if your heart felt the thunder, and subscribe to stay close for what comes next. Because the dawn that follows this storm will change everything. The dawn broke heavy with silence, the kind that came before something irreversible. The air still carried the scent of rain and gun oil, the ground damp beneath Jack's boots as he saddled his horse. He worked slow, methodical, hands steady, even as the weight in his chest pressed hard enough to bruise. The world had gone grey, the kind of morning where even the sun hesitated to rise. He glanced once toward the house. Light flickered in the window, faint but alive. He imagined Clara standing there, eyes wide, holding on to hope she didn't dare speak aloud. Eliza would be beside her, guarding that fragile hope like a flame against the wind. He tightened the cinch strap and mounted, the saddle creaking softly under his weight. "Easy now," he murmured to the horse, his voice low, more prayer than command. The animal snorted, ears twitching toward the horizon, the sky stretched endless, the plains shimmering with leftover mist. Somewhere out there waited the broken church, the meeting place where Wade's men gathered like carrion crows. Somewhere beyond that was Tom, his own brother, walking the narrow line between guilt and damnation. Jack rode with the kind of purpose that leaves no room for fear. Each hoofbeat struck deep into the mud, echoing against the vast emptiness. He passed the ridge where the river cut through the valley, the water swollen and restless from the storm. The land here carried memories of battles fought, graves dug, promises broken. He'd buried too many men in this dirt, some by choice, others by mercy. Redemption wasn't something he expected to find on this road. It was something he intended to give away. By midday, the church came into view, a skeleton of wood and stone half swallowed by the earth. The steeple leaned to one side, the cross at its peak rusted and bent. Jack slowed his horse, scanning the horizon. No movement, no sound but the buzz of flies and the distant rumble of thunder rolling back across the mountains. He dismounted, tying the reins to a fence post that looked ready to splinter. The ground squelched beneath his boots as he approached the door, one hand resting near his holster. "Anyone here?" he called out, his voice rough from the ride. The echo came back hollow, ghostly. Then, from the shadows, a voice answered, a voice that carried the dry rasp of old sin. "Always thought you'd die slow, Captain." Jack froze. The name hit him like a memory. "Corbin," he muttered. Out from behind a broken pew stepped a man built like the memory of violence itself. Broad shoulders, a crooked smile, eyes as empty as the desert. He wore a long coat, dust-stained, his gun low at his side. "Wade sends his regards," Corbin said. "He figured you'd show. Always did have a hero's itch." Jack sighed. "I'm no hero." "No," Corbin replied, stepping closer. "You're a ghost who don't know he's dead yet." The words hung heavy in the stale air. Jack's hand drifted toward his Colt, but slow, respectful, as if acknowledging a truth between them. "You don't have to do this," he said. "Walk away. Let it end here." Corbin laughed, a low, bitter sound. "Ain't no walking away from the devil's work. You taught me that." He lifted his gun, and the world stopped breathing. The first shot cracked the silence wide open. The second followed almost instantly, a flash of light and thunder inside the church's hollow bones. Dust exploded from the pews. Jack staggered back, pain tearing through his shoulder. Corbin dropped to his knees, eyes wide, blood blooming dark against his shirt. He tried to speak, but no words came. Just the faint rattle of a man realizing too late what he'd become. Jack knelt beside him, his own breath uneven. The old wooden floor smelled of rain and gunpowder. Corbin's hand twitched toward something glinting beside him, a brass lighter. Jack picked it up, rolling it in his palm. The initials were carved deep, worn by years of use. T.C. Tom Callahan. The blood in Jack's veins turned to fire. His brother's name, his brother's lighter. He closed his fist around it. "You were working for him," he said quietly. Corbin's lips moved, barely forming the words. "He's coming. He's already." Then the light left his eyes. Outside, thunder cracked across the plains. Jack stood slowly, every muscle in his body aching, and looked down at the dead man. "Then let him come," he whispered. He stepped outside, the wind tugging at his coat, the sky bruised with storm clouds gathering again. The rain began to fall, cold, sharp, cleansing. He mounted his horse, blood seeping through his sleeve, and turned toward the valley. Each drop of rain stung against his skin, washing away the dust, the guilt, the years. The path home stretched long and uncertain, but he rode it anyway, driven by something deeper than vengeance. He thought of Clara's face, the way her eyes softened when she spoke his name. He thought of Eliza's trembling hands holding that box of truth. And beneath it all, he thought of Tom, his brother, his blood, his ghost. By the time he reached the edge of the valley, the world had turned to silver mist. The rain came down harder now, a steady rhythm against the land. His horse stumbled once, regaining its footing. The ranch was still miles away, but he could already see the faint flicker of lantern light in his mind, the home he had built and lost, waiting to bear witness to one last reckoning. The pain in his shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, but he welcomed it. Pain meant he was still alive. Pain meant there was still work to do. The storm's wind howled through the canyon, echoing like the voice of the past calling him home. When the ranch finally came into view, it was a ghostly outline against the rain. The barn door slammed open and shut, the wind howling through its broken frame. Clara stood on the porch, clutching a lantern, her hair whipping around her face. Behind her, Eliza's silhouette moved quickly, her voice faint against the thunder. Jack dismounted, boots sinking into the mud. The front door burst open before he could reach it. Tom stood there, drenched, eyes wild with something between rage and shame. His hand trembled around a revolver. "Jack," he said, his voice cracking like lightning splitting the sky. "You shouldn't have come." Jack stopped a few feet away, breathing hard. "Didn't have a choice." He held up the brass lighter. "You left this behind." Tom's eyes flickered to it, then away. "It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," Jack said softly. "You're in deep, and you're drowning everyone with you." The rain fell harder, drumming on the roof, running down their faces like tears neither of them could shed. Tom's hand shook. "You don't understand," he said. "Wade owns everything. Owns me." "You let him," Jack replied, voice calm but edged with grief. "You always had a choice." Tom's breath came ragged. "And what choice did you ever give me, brother? You left. You got to be the good one." Jack took a step closer, his voice breaking. "Being decent never made me good, Tom. It just kept me human." The gun between them trembled. For a heartbeat, everything was still. The rain, the wind, the world itself. Then came the sound that split it all apart. A single gunshot. Smoke curled into the air. Tom fell to his knees, eyes wide in disbelief, the gun still warm in his hand. Jack caught him before he hit the ground. The mud turned red beneath them. "Why?" Jack whispered. "You could have built something honest." Tom's voice was faint now, like a child's. "Being decent. It never saved anyone." Jack shook his head, tears mixing with rain. "It saved you now." Tom tried to speak again, but no words came. His chest rose once, then stilled. The storm eased, as if the heavens themselves had sighed in mourning. Jack stayed there for a long while, holding his brother's lifeless body, the rain washing the blood from both their hands. In the distance, the thunder softened, rolling back toward the hills. When he finally stood, the lighter slipped from his grasp, sinking into the wet earth where it belonged. He turned toward the house. Through the blur of rain, he saw Clara and Eliza standing in the doorway. Clara's face was pale, streaked with tears, but her eyes were steady. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He walked toward them slowly, every step heavier than the last. When he reached the porch, he stopped. She reached for his hand, small, trembling, alive. He let her hold it. The wind quieted, the rain thinning to a soft drizzle. Jack looked past her shoulder, into the house that had carried so much silence, and for the first time he felt something like peace. Not joy, not redemption, just the soft, tired peace that comes after the storm. And somewhere deep inside him, a truth he'd long forgotten stirred again, that maybe healing isn't about erasing the pain, but learning to carry it with gentleness. The night settled into stillness, the land breathing slow again. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, and he closed his eyes, letting the warmth of her presence seep through the ache. The storm had passed, but its memory would stay like a scar, tender, real, and alive. If you're still here, breathing through this rain with them, let your heart rest for a moment. Sometimes all it takes is a story to remind us that goodness still stands, even in the ruins. Tap the like if the quiet after the storm reached you. Share your thought in the comments to let another wandering soul know they're not alone, and subscribe to keep walking this road of love and redemption, because what comes next is not an ending, but the beginning of healing. The dawn after the storm came soft and colorless, the kind of morning that did not yet dare to hope. The world smelled of wet soil and smoke. The horizon still trembled from the echo of thunder. Inside the small ranch house, the fire had burned down to embers, their faint light brushing the wooden floor in strokes of amber and grey. Clara sat near the window, wrapped in one of Jack's old wool blankets, her eyes heavy with sleeplessness. The night had stolen too much. Tom's body lay buried beneath the willow near the creek, the earth still freshly turned, the rain having pressed it flat like a sealed memory. Jack hadn't spoken since. He had dug the grave himself, every strike of the shovel against the mud sounding like a confession. Eliza had tried to help, but he had shaken his head once, wordless. When he finished, he stood for a long time beside the mound, hat in hand, the wind lifting his damp hair. There were no prayers. Some griefs had already been prayed through. He simply whispered his brother's name, as if that alone could guide the lost soul home. Clara watched him through the window, her chest aching with something she couldn't name. It was not pity. It was recognition. She knew what it was to bury something you loved, even if it was still breathing. When he finally came inside, his boots thick with mud, his face drawn and tired, she met his eyes. There was nothing to say. Words were too fragile for that kind of silence. He poured himself coffee, though his hands trembled slightly as he lifted the cup. The smell filled the air, bitter, grounding. "You should rest," Clara said softly. Her voice felt small, careful. "Later," he murmured, his tone low. too much left undone. She hesitated before stepping closer, her hand hovering near his arm. "You did what you had to do," she whispered. He looked at her then, eyes rimmed red but steady. "Doesn't make it right." "No," she said. "But it makes it over." That quiet truth hung between them, a fragile thread holding back the breaking. Jack took a slow breath and set his cup down. "He was my brother," he said finally. "We were supposed to build something decent here. Instead—" his voice faltered. "I gave him a gun, and he gave me back a grave." Clara didn't move for a moment. Then she reached out and touched his hand, the one that had pulled the trigger. It was a small, trembling gesture, but the way he closed his fingers around hers felt like a man trying to hold on to the last light before night. "You can't carry his sins and yours both," she said gently. "It'll break you." He looked at her, and for the first time, something inside him softened. Her eyes were tired but alive, full of that quiet strength that refuses to die even when everything else does. He thought of the first time he saw her, bound and bleeding in the dust, whispering not to be saved. Now she stood before him, unbound, voice steady, saving him without meaning to. Eliza stepped into the room then, her face pale, her eyes swollen from crying. "There's movement down by the ridge," she said. "Wade's men. They're coming." Jack straightened immediately, the moment of stillness shattering. "How many?" "4, maybe 5. They're moving slow. Searching." He reached for his coat, wincing as his shoulder protested. Clara moved closer, gripping his arm. "You're hurt." "I'll manage," he said. "They'll follow the tracks. We can't stay here." Eliza's voice trembled. "Where will we go?" "North," Jack said. "The canyon forks near the pass. There's a line of old mines along the ridge. We can lose them there." He started toward the door, but Clara stepped in front of him, her face fierce in a way that startled him. "You're bleeding again," she said. "You can't fight like this." Jack gave a faint, rueful smile. "You'd be surprised what a man can do when there's something left worth protecting." His hand brushed her cheek, so lightly it felt like a promise. "Pack what you need. We leave now." They moved quickly, Eliza gathering the papers and the box, Clara wrapping bread and canteens into a sack, Jack checking his rifle. The sound of hooves grew faintly in the distance, still far but closing fast. The land outside shimmered with morning haze, the air thick and humming. By the time they rode out, the sun had begun to burn through the mist. Clara rode behind Jack, her arms around his waist, her cheek pressed against his back. The steady rhythm of the horse beneath them matched the slow, steady beat of his heart. For the first time since she had met him, she felt safe not because there was no danger, but because he faced it for her. That kind of safety had nothing to do with walls. It came from trust, quiet and alive. They reached the canyon by midday, the heat rising in waves. The mines yawned black against the cliffs, old scars on the land. Jack dismounted and led the horse into the shadow of the largest one. The air was cooler there, thick with the scent of stone and memory. They rested for a while, the silence broken only by the drip of water echoing from deep within. Clara sat beside him, brushing dust from her skirt. "You ever wonder," she said softly, "if people like us were meant to find peace, or if we're just built for surviving it?" Jack leaned back against the rock, eyes on the thin slit of light at the cave's mouth. "Peace ain't something you find," he said. "It's something you carry, even through the noise." She smiled faintly. "You talk like someone who's found a little of it." "Maybe just borrowed it," he said. "From you." The quiet between them felt alive. Healing didn't announce itself. It came like this, through soft moments, through shared breath, through the realization that maybe, after everything, you still had something left to give. When they finally emerged from the mine, the world had changed again. The sun was lower, the sky painted with gold and rust. In the distance, the riders had stopped following. The wind carried nothing but silence. Eliza breathed out in relief, tears bright on her cheeks. "We lost them," she said. Jack nodded, scanning the horizon one last time. For now. They rode until the sky deepened into twilight. When they found a small ridge overlooking the valley, Jack decided to stop. He built a small fire, the smoke curling upward like prayer. Clara sat close, the warmth brushing her face, the light reflecting in her eyes. The flames painted him in hues of copper and shadow, his rough edges softened by the glow. "Do you ever regret staying alive?" she asked quietly. He looked into the fire. "Every day," he said. "Until now." The words hung there, simple and true. She felt her heart tighten, not with fear, but with something gentler. Recognition, gratitude, the ache of hope. The fire popped softly. The stars began to emerge, shy and shimmering. Eliza had fallen asleep against her saddle, exhaustion claiming her at last. The world felt wide and still again. Jack took something from his coat, a small book, weathered and worn. He turned it over in his hands before offering it to Clara. "Here," he said. "It's yours." She frowned softly. "What is it?" "Great Expectations," he said. "My mother gave it to me when I was a boy. Said when I was lost, I should read a page and remember who I wanted to be." Her hands trembled as she took it. The pages were yellowed, the spine cracked, the ink faded by time and rain, but it felt alive in her hands. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't have words." "You don't need them," he said. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "When all this ends, teach again." Her eyes filled, the tears glistening in the firelight. "You really think there'll be an end?" He smiled faintly. "There's always an end, but it doesn't always mean loss." She looked down at the book, tracing the worn letters on the cover. The fire crackled, the wind humming low through the grass. She whispered, almost to herself, "Maybe the end's just the place where we finally stop running." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe it's where we start living." She leaned against him then, her head resting on his shoulder. The night wrapped around them like a blanket, the stars above burning softly through the dark. He didn't move, didn't speak. Just let the quiet fill them both until the ache began to ease. Somewhere far off, the valley sighed with the memory of rain. The land felt clean again, even if only for a while, and as the fire dimmed, Clara whispered, "Thank you, Jack." "For saving me." He turned his head slightly, his breath brushing her hair. "You saved me first," he said. The night deepened, gentle and endless. Healing came not as a miracle, but as the slow realization that broken things could still hold light. And if your heart, listening here beneath the same quiet stars, feels a little lighter, let it stay. Sometimes all we need is to breathe alongside another story to remember our own courage. Press the like if the warmth reached you. Share your voice in the comments so another wandering soul might find it too. And subscribe if you believe that love, even in its quietest form, still finds a way to begin again. The dawn came quiet, like a slow breath after years of holding it in. The storm had passed. The valley lay washed and glistening beneath the morning sun, the air clear enough to taste. The earth no longer felt like a battlefield, it felt reborn. Birds returned in timid song, and the scent of wet sage and pine drifted through the wind like forgiveness itself. Jack stood at the edge of the ridge, looking down at the world spread out below. His coat was damp, his hat low over his eyes, and yet for the first time in decades he didn't feel the weight of the past crushing his spine. He felt light, fragile, yes, but alive. Behind him, Clara stirred the coals of a small fire. Eliza slept still, wrapped in a blanket, her breathing soft and steady. The bruises under her eyes were fading. The lines of fear across her face were loosening. In the light of morning, she looked younger, like the girl she must have been before this land turned cruel. Clara poured water into a tin cup and stood, walking toward Jack. The grass brushed her ankles, still wet from the night's rain. She stopped beside him, silent for a while. The view stretched forever. Gold hills, distant mountains, a sky scrubbed clean of sorrow. He didn't turn to look at her when he spoke. "It's a strange thing," he said softly, "how the world can look brand new the day after it almost ends." She smiled faintly. "Maybe that's how it's supposed to be. You have to lose something before you can see what's left." He nodded, his jaw tight but calm. "Tom's gone. Wade's still out there somewhere. But for once, I don't feel hunted." He turned then, eyes meeting hers. "Do you?" Clara looked at him, her face framed by the sun, her hair catching the wind. "I feel free," she said quietly, "and terrified of what that means." Jack's lips curved into the smallest of smiles. "Freedom's supposed to scare you. It means you've got something left to live for." They walked together down toward the camp. Eliza woke as they approached, blinking against the light. She smiled weakly when she saw them, clutching the edge of the blanket around her shoulders. "You both look different," she said. "Like people who've seen heaven and hell and came back anyway." Clara knelt beside her, pouring a little water from the canteen into her cup. "Maybe that's what healing is," she murmured. "Not forgetting what happened, just learning how to walk again." Eliza's eyes filled with quiet tears. "Then I suppose we're all learning." They ate a small breakfast. Bread gone dry from travel, coffee thin but warm. It didn't matter. It tasted like peace. When they finished, Jack packed the saddlebags while the women folded the blankets. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was gentle, full of unspoken trust. By the time they mounted up, the sky had turned to pale blue. The air buzzed faintly with the hum of insects, and the land felt alive again. Jack led the way north along the ridge, the path cutting through the wildflowers just starting to bloom. Clara rode beside him, her hand occasionally brushing his when the horses drew close. Neither pulled away. As they rode, she looked out across the valley and said, "You think people like Wade ever stop? Men who build their empires on other people's pain?" Jack's gaze stayed on the horizon. "No, but I think one day they meet a world that don't need them anymore, and that's enough." The road narrowed, winding down toward the plains. When they reached the bottom, they came upon a small stream glittering beneath the sun. Jack stopped his horse, dismounted, and knelt to let the water run through his fingers. "It's clean," he said softly, almost surprised. Clara slid down from her horse, crouching beside him. The stream was shallow, but the sound of it filled the air like a hymn. She cupped her hands, drank, and smiled. "It tastes like spring." He watched her as she laughed quietly, water dripping down her chin, her eyes bright for the first time since he'd found her in the desert. He hadn't realized how much he needed that sound, the music of someone remembering how to live. They rested there for a while. Eliza lay in the grass, staring at the clouds drifting lazily across the blue. "Feels like another life," she whispered. "One where I didn't have to run." Clara looked over, her tone soft. "Maybe this is that life, starting now." Jack stood and looked north, where the hills rose into the distance. "There's a town 2 days from here," he said. "Small. Church, schoolhouse, clean well. You can start again there." Eliza nodded slowly. "And you?" Jack's eyes followed a hawk circling high above. "I'll ride a while longer." Clara felt her stomach twist at the quiet finality in his voice. "You mean you're leaving?" she asked. He turned toward her. "Not yet, but soon. I've got to finish something first." She took a step closer, her heart aching with something she didn't dare name. "You don't owe this land anything, Jack. You've given enough of yourself to ghosts." He looked at her then, really looked, and his eyes softened. "You're right. But I made a promise once, to do what's right, even when it costs me." He paused, then added gently, "You gave me back what I'd lost, the part of me that still believes it matters." Her breath caught. "And what about the part of you that needs to rest?" He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering just long enough to make her close her eyes. "That part," he said, "I think I'll leave here, with you." She wanted to speak, but no words came. The world around them seemed to slow, the sun warming their faces, the sound of the river running steady. When they reached the next ridge, the land opened into a wide plain, wildflowers rippling in waves of yellow and white. The wind carried the scent of new beginnings. Jack reined in his horse, letting Clara and Eliza ride ahead. He watched them laugh softly, the sunlight catching in their hair, and felt something deep in his chest shift. It wasn't joy exactly. It was quieter, steadier, something like healing finally taking root. As the day stretched on, they reached the outskirts of a small settlement. A few wooden buildings, smoke rising from chimneys, a church bell echoing faintly. Children ran along the dusty road, their laughter rising like prayer. Clara stared, her eyes wide, a tremor in her voice. "A schoolhouse," she whispered. "There's a schoolhouse." Jack smiled faintly. "Looks like they've been waiting for a teacher." She turned to him, disbelief giving way to wonder. "You remembered." "Hard to forget," he said softly. They stopped at the edge of town. Eliza dismounted first, clutching her bag. "This is far enough for me," she said. I've got family out east. Maybe it's time I went home." Jack nodded, taking her hand gently. "You did brave things, Eliza. Don't let the world tell you otherwise." She smiled through tears. "You too, Jack Callahan. You still believe in decency, and that's rarer than gold." When she rode off, Clara watched until the dust settled behind her, then turned back to Jack. "And what about you?" He handed her the small book again, the one she'd carried like a relic. "Keep this. It belongs to someone who believes in tomorrow." Her fingers brushed his as she took it, and something unspoken passed between them, something fragile, sacred. "You're not coming with me, are you?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "This is your place now. Teach them. Make it mean something. The rest, I'll figure out on the road." Her throat tightened. "You'll come back?" He smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes soft. "If the wind's kind." For a moment she couldn't breathe. She stepped closer, reaching up to touch his face, her fingertips tracing the edge of his jaw. He closed his eyes, the warmth of her skin against his, enough to quiet every ghost inside him. She whispered, "Thank you for giving me back my name." He leaned his forehead against hers, his voice barely a breath. "You gave me back my soul." The wind rose softly around them, lifting strands of her hair, carrying their silence out into the vast open world. He kissed her forehead, tender and unhurried, then stepped back, his hand brushing hers as he turned toward his horse. She stood there watching as he mounted, her heart breaking and healing all at once. He looked back only once, tipping his hat. The sunlight caught him in gold, outlining him against the endless plain. Then he rode away, his figure growing smaller until he became part of the horizon itself. Clara pressed the book to her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks, though she was smiling through them. Around her, the world pulsed with life, the laughter of children, the rustle of wind, the hum of something eternal. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "Be safe, Jack." And in that moment, though he was miles away, he felt it, the soft warmth of her voice carried by the wind. It settled into him like peace. The road stretched ahead, endless and golden. Jack rode with his back straight, his shadow long behind him, his heart lighter than it had ever been. The pain was still there, but it no longer ruled him. He was no longer running from it. He was riding with it, learning its rhythm, letting it guide him forward. Sometimes redemption doesn't come as forgiveness. Sometimes it comes as understanding, as the quiet knowledge that you can still do good in a world that broke you. And as the sun dipped low behind him, painting the plains in crimson light, Jack Callahan finally felt free. If you felt the warmth of this dawn in your heart, let it stay. Healing is not a destination, it's a gentle return to yourself. Leave a word for the lost souls still wandering. Press that, like if the piece touched you, and subscribe so you can ride with us again when the next light rises over the wild west of hearts, still learning to love. The morning broke with a hush that felt like grace itself. The town still slept beneath a quilt of pale gold mist, the rooftops glistening with dew. Clara stood outside the small schoolhouse, her hands trembling around a bundle of worn books. The door creaked open beneath her touch, and sunlight spilled across the wooden floor like spilled honey. It smelled of dust and new beginnings, chalk, cedar, and something sweeter, something alive. The desks were old, carved with the names of children long gone, but the blackboard weighted clean. She placed the books gently on the teacher's desk, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. The same heart that had once known only fear now pulsed with quiet purpose. She ran her hand across the smooth surface of the wood and whispered, almost to herself, "We're starting over." Outside, the wind carried the scent of the fields. Somewhere far away, a horse's distant cry echoed across the plains. She turned toward the sound instinctively, her eyes scanning the horizon as if her heart had learned to listen to the world for him. There was nothing, only the wide, shimmering expanse of land stretching toward the sky. Yet she smiled, soft and certain. "I know you're out there," she murmured. The children began arriving slowly, one by one, their laughter breaking the stillness like sunlight breaking through clouds. Some came barefoot, faces smudged with dirt, eyes wide with wonder. They filled the room with noise, with life, with innocence she hadn't heard in so long. Clara felt her throat tighten as she stood before them. "Good morning," she said, voice trembling. "I'm Miss Clara." The words sounded strange but good, like a name reborn. A little boy raised his hand. "You gonna teach us letters, ma'am?" She smiled, her eyes warm. Letters and stories and everything else worth knowing. The class erupted in laughter, and she laughed too. The sound was light and clear, echoing through the room like a healing prayer. She wrote the first word on the board, hope, and paused to look at it. The chalk dust clung to her fingers, soft as promise. "That's where we begin," she said softly. "Right here." Outside, the sunlight grew stronger, pouring through the windows, filling every shadow. The world had turned quietly, beautifully. For the first time, Clara realized she wasn't waiting for rescue anymore. She was building something, something gentle, something worth staying for. Days passed, then weeks. The town grew to love her. The teacher with the soft voice and the faraway eyes. They said she carried peace in her hands, that even the wild horses near the ridge seemed calmer when she was near. But when the wind blew just right, carrying the scent of dust and leather, her heart would stir. She'd step outside, her gaze drifting to the horizon. Sometimes in the distance she thought she saw him, a lone rider against the sun, hat tipped low, his horse moving steady through the golden light. She'd blink, and he'd vanish into the heat shimmer, but the peace he left behind stayed. At night, she sat by the window of her small cottage, the book he'd given her, Great Expectations, resting open on her lap. She read the same passage over and over, about how hearts, once broken, could still mend if one dared to believe. The words soothed her like prayer, and when the wind brushed the curtains, she would close her eyes and whisper into the quiet, "Good night, Jack." Miles away, under a sky full of stars, Jack Callahan camped beside a dying fire. His coat hung heavy with road dust, his hat resting on his knee. He gazed into the embers, their glow flickering across the lines of his face. In his hand he held a small scrap of paper, a page torn from the book he'd given her, one he'd copied down before he left. It was the same passage she read each night. He smiled faintly, feeling the echo of her voice in the wind. The world had changed around him. The war inside him had quieted. There were still men like Wade out there, men who burned the earth for gold, but for now the land slept peacefully. He'd made peace with his brother's ghost, with his own name, with the simple truth that redemption isn't a place you reach, but something you carry forward every day you wake and choose to keep going. When he finally lay down, the stars stretched endless above him, like a map of all the things he'd lost and found again. Somewhere beneath the same sky, a woman was teaching a child how to spell the word hope. And for Jack, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Clara's life took on a rhythm that felt like healing turned to music. Morning lessons, laughter through open windows, the clatter of wooden pencils, the rustle of pages. She began planting a small garden behind the school. Wildflowers, herbs and roses that refused to grow in the dry soil, but did anyway, stubborn as faith. Each bloom felt like a tiny miracle. On Sundays, she would sit beneath the willow tree near the creek, the same kind that grew near where Tom lay, and read aloud from her book. The children would gather around her, and the sound of her voice floated across the fields like a hymn. Her words carried love, loss, forgiveness. She told them about courage, about kindness, about how even broken things could still be beautiful if they dared to shine. The townsfolk sometimes whispered that she was waiting for someone, that maybe she'd been in love with a ghost. But Clara only smiled when she heard it. Ghosts didn't ride with the sunrise or leave you books filled with hope. He wasn't gone. He was everywhere the wind moved gently, everywhere the light fell soft. And sometimes, when the dusk turned to gold, she'd hear hooves far away, steady, familiar, fading slowly toward the hills. She'd close her eyes and let the sound wash through her, not as sorrow, but as peace. The years softened everything, her scars, the land, the sharp edges of memory. The children she taught grew into good men and women, strong and kind. They carried her lessons the way she carried his name, quietly, with reverence. One evening, when the sky burned orange and purple, she stood again at the edge of the field, her book in hand. The pages were worn, the cover frayed. She looked out toward the west, her voice gentle, steady. "You kept your promise, Jack," she whispered. "You gave the world something decent after all." The wind rose softly in answer, brushing against her skin, carrying the faint scent of rain and wild grass. She smiled, closing her eyes. "And I kept mine." In that stillness, she felt him there, not in form, but in presence. Not as a ghost, but as a warmth that wrapped around her heart like sunlight after a storm. She had learned that love, real love, doesn't end when people part. It lingers, in the way you teach, in the way you heal, in every small mercy you offer the world after someone once offered it to you. The sun dipped low, painting the town in amber and rose. The bell from the schoolhouse rang once in the distance, a soft echo fading into twilight. And as night fell, the first star appeared, bright, unwavering, eternal. Somewhere on the horizon, a lone rider continued west, his silhouette outlined by the dying light. He rode steady, the dust rising in a soft trail behind him, like memory, like prayer. He didn't look back, but his heart stayed tethered to the place where love had once waited and still lived on. The story wasn't about loss anymore. It was about what remains, the decency of a man who chose to do right, the courage of a woman who chose to begin again, and the invisible thread that bound them across miles and years. Because sometimes the most beautiful endings are not about goodbye, but about knowing you've become the person someone once prayed you'd be. So if this story touched something deep inside you, if you felt the warmth, the ache, the quiet hope, let it stay with you a little while longer. Take a breath. Let it heal something small in you. Then share that light forward. Leave a comment below. Tell someone what this journey meant to you. Tap that like button if your heart still believes in second chances, and subscribe so you can ride with us again when the next story finds its dawn. Some tales don't end, they just change shape, carrying love into every sunrise yet to come.